I had always thought love from family was unconditional, until the day it became a gift I no longer wanted. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one with the worn floral pattern that had molded perfectly to the shape of my body over 20 years. A thick, knitted blanket, a long-ago Christmas gift from my daughter, was wrapped around my shoulders, a useless shield against the chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. From this vantage point, I had a clear view of my life, or at least the remnants of it, moving through the rooms of the house I had once filled with noise and warmth and the smell of baking bread. Now, the only sound was the insistent tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a tiny hammer blow against the silence, marking time that no longer felt like it belonged to me. My son, Mark, a man of 40 now with his father's serious brow and a life of his own, drifted through the living room. His eyes, the same deep blue as mine, were glued to the glowing screen in his hand. He navigated the furniture with an unconscious grace, his body present in the room but his mind a million miles away, lost in a world of emails and notifications that held no space for the woman who taught him how to walk through this very room. He passed my chair without a flicker of acknowledgement, his presence a phantom limb of the connection we once shared. In the kitchen, I could hear my daughter, Sarah. Her voice, once a sweet melody that called for mommy, was now a sharp, efficient instrument used for closing deals and arranging social calendars. She was on the phone with a friend, the conversation a rapid-fire exchange of names I didn't know and places I'd never been. Laughter, bright and brittle, echoed off the sterile quartz countertops she'd insisted I install last year, promising they would increase the home's resale value. The promise felt like a threat then, and it felt like an eviction notice now. Are we having dinner together? I called out, my voice feeling rusty from disuse. There was a pause in her chatter. What, Mom? The words were laced with an impatient sigh, the universal sound of a child burdened by a parent dinner, I repeated, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I was just wondering about dinner. Oh. No. Mark and I were just going to grab a bite at that new Italian place. You wouldn't like it. It's very loud. Her voice returned to the cheerful pitch she reserved for her friend, leaving her explanation hanging in the air between us, as thin and useless as a spider's thread. You wouldn't like it. It was a phrase I had heard a lot lately. It was used to exclude me from trips to the city, from movies they wanted to see, from the vibrant, fast-paced lives they were living. It wasn't a question, but a verdict. They had decided for me what I would and would not like, and in doing so, had decided that I was no longer a part of their world. The contrast was a physical ache in my chest. I closed my eyes and for a second, I could almost smell the roast chicken that should have been in the oven. I could almost hear the chaotic symphony of a Sunday afternoon from years ago. The television blaring a football game, the phone ringing with a call for a teenager, the sound of Mark and Sarah bickering good-naturedly over the last cookie. In that memory, I was the sun around which their small, bright worlds revolved. They ran to me for scraped knees, for help with homework, for a hug after a nightmare. My lap was a sanctuary, my advice was gospel. My presence was the very foundation of their home. Now, I was just part of the furniture, a silent fixture in a house that was no longer a home, but a stopping point, a convenient place for them to drop their mail and do their laundry. The silence that followed Sarah's dismissal wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a presence in itself, a heavy, suffocating blanket of disregard. A few minutes later, Mark appeared in the doorway, shrugging on his coat. Sarah was behind him, checking her reflection in the hall mirror, dabbing at her lipstick. We're heading out, Mom, Mark said, his keys jingling in his hand. It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a statement of fact. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time all day, and his eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Was it guilt? Pity? It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar mask of preoccupied distance. All right, dear, I said, my voice a whisper. Have a nice time. Sarah blew a kiss in my general direction. Don't wait up. We'll probably be late. And then they were gone. The front door clicked shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet house. I heard their car start, the engine revving before fading into the distance, leaving me utterly and completely alone. The coldness of their departure, the casual, unthinking cruelty of it, settled in my bones. It wasn't a grand betrayal, not a dramatic scene from a movie. It was something far more insidious. It was the slow, steady erosion of my worth, a death by 1,000 tiny cuts of indifference. I was a relic from a life they had moved on from, a story they no longer had time to read. I sat there in my armchair, the knitted blanket clutched tight in my hands, as the afternoon light bled into the gray of evening outside my window. The ticking of the clock grew louder, each second a reminder of the empty hours stretching before me. And in that moment, a tiny, unfamiliar spark ignited in the cold ashes of my heart. It wasn't just sadness. It was anger, a hot, fierce flame of frustration and heartbreak that burned away the fog of resignation I had been living in for so long. They were going to dinner without me. They had left me behind. And for the first time, I didn't just feel the pain of their absence. I felt the injustice of it. It was a thought so sharp and clear it startled me. This love, this thing I had given my entire life to, was no longer a comfort. It was a cage. The house was so quiet, it hummed. It was the kind of deep, ringing silence that makes you notice the sound of your own blood pulsing in your ears. I stayed in that chair long after the last sliver of daylight had vanished, the darkness a comforting cloak. In the gloom, my mind began to drift, untethered from the painful present, floating back into the sun-drenched landscapes of the past. It was a dangerous journey, I knew. Memory was a double-edged sword, capable of both soothing and slashing, but it was the only company I had. I saw Mark, barely 5 years old, his face a perfect circle of concentration as he took his first wobbly steps on his own. He'd stumbled from the sofa to my waiting arms, collapsing against me in a fit of triumphant giggles. I remembered the feel of his small, solid body in my arms, the sweet, milky scent of his hair. I had whispered in his ear, "You did it, my brave boy. You'll go so far." I never imagined he would go so far away from me. Then came a flash of Sarah, age 7, on our family vacation to the coast. She was terrified of the ocean, the vast, roaring expanse of blue. She clung to my hand, her knuckles white, as the waves foamed around her ankles. Her father, John, ever the pragmatist, had told her there was nothing to be afraid of. But I knew fear wasn't rational. I sat with her on the warm sand, and we built a magnificent sandcastle, a fortress with seashell windows and a seaweed flag. We watched the tide creep closer, and I told her, "It's okay to be scared, sweetie. But look, even when the water comes, we can always build again." For the rest of the week, she ventured a little deeper each day, never letting go of my hand, her trust in me more powerful than her fear of the unknown. Where was that trust now? The ghost of my husband, John, flickered at the edge of my thoughts. We had built this life together, brick by brick. He was a good man, steady and reliable, but not one for grand emotional displays. His love was in his actions, the shelves he built, the leaky faucets he fixed, the steady income he provided. After he passed away 5 years ago, the silence in the house had a different quality. It was the silence of grief, of a shared life suddenly halved. But it wasn't the silence of neglect. My children had rallied around me then, their concern a warm blanket. Mark handled the funeral arrangements with a quiet competence that reminded me so much of his father. Sarah stayed with me for 2 weeks, sleeping in her old room, filling the house with her presence, making sure I ate. We'd looked through old photo albums, laughing and crying, united in our loss. When had that unity fractured? When did their concern curdle into obligation, and then into outright disregard? It hadn't been a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping tide, like the one that had washed away Sarah's sandcastle all those years ago. It began with missed Sunday dinners, excused by work deadlines or plans with friends. Then came the shortened phone calls, their voices distracted, always in a rush. "Gotta go, Mom." Holidays became a source of stress, a negotiation of schedules. They started spending Christmas Eve with their in-laws, then Christmas afternoon with their own friends. My home, once the undisputed hub of all family activity, became just one stop on a busy itinerary. My internal dialogue became a torturous loop of self-recrimination. Did I do something wrong? The question haunted my waking hours and infiltrated my dreams. Was it because I didn't embrace technology quickly enough? My flip phone was a source of constant, gentle mockery. "Oh, Mom, you're a dinosaur." Was it because I sometimes repeated stories? I'd see a familiar glazed look in their eyes and my words would trail off, the memory turning to dust in my mouth. Or was it something deeper? Had I loved them too much? Had I made my role as their mother so central to my identity that when they no longer needed a mother in the same way, I simply ceased to exist in any meaningful capacity? Was it my fault for not cultivating a life of my own outside of them? John and I had been content with our quiet life. Our world was each other, and our children. When he left, half my world vanished. Now, the other half was walking out the door without a backward glance. I pushed myself out of the armchair, my joints protesting. The house felt vast and empty. I walked into the kitchen and stood before the gleaming quartz countertops. My reflection was a pale, ghostly image in the polished stone. I saw a woman with lines etched around her eyes and mouth, a map of a life filled with laughter and worry. I saw silver threads woven through my hair, and the slight stoop in my shoulders that spoke of years spent carrying burdens, both literal and emotional. I didn't recognize the deep, weary sadness in my own eyes. This wasn't me. The Eve I knew was strong, resilient, the heart of her family. This woman in the reflection looked defeated. The contrast between the vibrant, laughing memories and the cold, silent reality was a chasm I could no longer ignore. The past wasn't a comfort, it was a testament to how much I had lost. Each happy memory was a fresh wound, a reminder of a love that now felt like a distant country I could no longer visit. The warmth of yesterday only made the cold of today more bitter. I had given them everything, my time, my energy, my unwavering love. And in return, they had given me this crushing silence. The spark of anger from earlier flickered again, stronger this time. The question wasn't just did I do something wrong? A new, terrifying question was beginning to form, whispered from a part of myself I had long ignored. What if I did everything right, and it still wasn't enough? The weeks that followed that Sunday dinner blurred into a monotonous cycle of quiet days and long nights. I existed on the periphery of my own family, a satellite in a decaying orbit. The house, once a bustling nexus of activity, was now more like a museum of a life that was no longer being lived. The photos on the mantelpiece, of smiling children with missing teeth, of awkward teenage proms, of proud college graduations, seemed to mock me from their silver frames. They were artifacts from a forgotten civilization. Family gatherings, once the highlight of my calendar, became exercises in endurance. The following month was Thanksgiving, a holiday I had always cherished. In years past, preparations would begin a week in advance. The house would fill with the scents of sage and cinnamon, and the comforting rhythm of chopping and stirring. John would be in charge of the turkey, a responsibility he took with grave seriousness, and the kids would be underfoot, sneaking tastes of cookie dough and setting the table with a chaotic sort of glee. This year, Sarah called me 2 days before. "Mom, listen, we've had a change of plans," she said, her voice rushed. "Mark's in-laws have invited us all to their place. It's just easier, you know. A bigger house, and Susan's mother is a fantastic cook, no offense. It saves you all the trouble." "Saves me the trouble." The phrase was meant to sound considerate, but it landed like an insult. The trouble was the entire point. The effort, the work, the creation of a feast, it was an act of love. To have it dismissed as a mere chore was to have the love itself dismissed. "Oh," I said, the single word feeling heavy as lead in my mouth. "I see." "Don't worry, we'll swing by and pick you up around 2. Just be ready, okay?" They live about an hour away. And so, on Thanksgiving Day, I found myself a guest in a stranger's home, surrounded by the loud, boisterous family of my son's wife, Susan. They were perfectly pleasant people, welcoming me with polite smiles and offering me a comfortable chair. But I was an outsider, an appendix to my own children. I sat on a plush sofa, a plate of expertly cooked but unfamiliar food balanced on my knee, and watched. I watched Mark laugh at a joke told by his father-in-law. I watched Sarah animatedly discussing a new TV show with Susan's sister. I saw my grandchildren, absorbed in a video game with their cousins, speaking a language of digital characters I couldn't comprehend. I was in a crowded room, yet I had never felt more alone. The air buzzed with conversation, a web of shared histories and inside jokes that I couldn't penetrate. I tried to join in once or twice. I mentioned a funny thing our old cat, Mittens, used to do, and was met with a few polite, blank smiles before the conversation seamlessly flowed around me and moved on. I was a rock in the middle of a stream, the water of their lives parting to avoid me before rejoining on the other side, as if I were never there. The feeling of being invisible was a strange and deeply unsettling sensation. It was as if my voice had lost its frequency, unable to be heard by the people who mattered most. My existence seemed to have been downgraded from a necessity to a minor, easily overlooked detail. They had all moved on, building new centers of gravity, new family units where I was merely a visitor. They had outgrown me, and in doing so, had left me in a state of emotional limbo, a ghost haunting the edges of their new lives. Later that evening, after being dropped back at my silent house, the smell of other people's Thanksgiving clinging to my coat, I understood the harsh truth. My children didn't hate me. They weren't cruel in a deliberate, malicious way. In some respects, that would have been easier to understand. This was worse. It was a complete and total thoughtlessness. I simply didn't enter their minds unless a holiday or a sense of duty required them to remember me. My emotional needs, my desire for connection, my simple wish to be seen and heard, these things were not on their radar. I had become a box to be checked. Call mom? Check. Visit mom on Mother's Day? Check. Pick mom up for Thanksgiving? Check. The spontaneity, the genuine warmth, the easy comfort of our old relationship was gone, replaced by a perfunctory sense of obligation. The physical proximity of being in the same room with them only served to amplify the vast emotional distance that now separated us. I looked at the family photos again, this time with a chilling new clarity. I wasn't just remembering a happy past, I was mourning a future I had always taken for granted, a future where I would be the beloved matriarch, surrounded by a loving, attentive family. That future was a fantasy. The reality was this room, this silence, this profound and suffocating loneliness. I was alone in a crowd of my own making, and the weight of that realization was heavier than any I had ever carried. I had poured my entire being into a foundation that had crumbled, leaving me standing in the ruins, wondering if there was anything left to salvage. The final straw, the one that broke the back of my long-suffering patience, came not with a bang, but with a whisper of indifference. It was a gray Saturday afternoon in early December. The first flurries of snow were drifting past the window, and the world outside was hushed and soft. I was feeling particularly nostalgic, a dangerous state of mind for me lately. I had been sorting through a box of old jewelry, untangling chains and polishing tarnished silver, when I came across a small, delicate locket. It was gold, shaped like a heart, with a tiny sapphire chip at its center. My own mother had given it to me on my 16th birthday. Inside, behind the tiny hinged frames, were two faded, minuscule photographs. One was of my mother as a young woman, her smile hopeful and bright. The other was of me, a black and white baby picture. The locket was more than just an object, it was a vessel of history, a tangible link in the chain of mothers and daughters. I had always planned to give it to Sarah one day. She had stopped by, a rare, unannounced visit, to pick up a piece of mail that had been mistakenly sent to my address. She was in a hurry, as always, her coat still on, her car keys dangling from her fingers. She stood in the middle of the living room, exuding an aura of restless energy, already thinking about her next destination. "Sarah, look what I found," I said, my voice softer than I intended. I held the locket in the palm of my hand, the gold catching the dim afternoon light. She glanced at it distractedly. "Oh, that's nice, Mom." Her eyes were already drifting toward the door. "It was your grandmother's," I began, my heart swelling with the story I wanted to share. "She gave it to me when I was 16. She told me it was to remind me that my heart would always hold a piece of her, just as hers would always hold a piece of me. I remember the day so clearly." "Mom, I'm really sorry, but I have to run," she cut me off, not unkindly, but with a finality that stole the air from my lungs. "I'm meeting Jen for yoga in 20 minutes, and the traffic is going to be a nightmare." She took a step toward me, gave my shoulder a quick, perfunctory squeeze, and grabbed the letter from the hall table. "We'll catch up soon, okay? Love you." The front door clicked shut, and I was left standing in the center of the room, the locket still resting in my open palm. The story died on my lips, the precious memory turning to ash. It wasn't just that she was in a hurry. It was the complete disinterest in her eyes, the easy, thoughtless way she had dismissed something that meant so much to me. She hadn't just brushed off my story, she had brushed off our history, our connection, the very lineage of love that the locket represented. She didn't want the story. And in that moment, I realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that she probably didn't want the locket, either. It would just be another piece of old jewelry to her, tossed in a drawer, its meaning and memory lost. Something inside me snapped. It was a clean, sharp break, like a frozen branch cracking under the weight of the snow. All the tiny cuts, the missed dinners, the thoughtless comments, the suffocating invisibility, they all coalesced into this one, single moment of profound rejection. I had spent months, years, making excuses for them. "They're busy. They have their own lives. They don't mean it." But they did mean it. Not with malice, but with an indifference that was somehow more wounding. My feelings, my memories, my very being, were not important enough to warrant 5 minutes of their time. I closed my hand around the locket, the delicate edges pressing into my skin. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the emotional agony that was flooding my system. I had been trying so hard, desperately paddling to keep my head above the waters of their neglect, pretending I wasn't drowning. But I was. And for what? To maintain the illusion of a happy family, to save them from the discomfort of my sadness? To protect a connection that, for them, no longer truly existed? I walked over to my armchair and sank into it, the locket still clenched in my fist. The emotional weight of it all, the loneliness, the disappointment, the erasure of my own value, became an unbearable physical pressure in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't cry. I was frozen in the Arctic silence of their departure. The pretense was over. I could no longer pretend that everything was okay, that their love was just buried under the stress of modern life. It wasn't buried. It was gone. And in its place was a void that threatened to swallow me whole. I looked around the room, at the furniture I had picked out, the curtains I had sewn, the photos of the children I had raised. This house was not a home. It was a cage I had built for myself, furnished with memories and decorated with disappointment. The thought of walking away, of simply packing a bag and leaving it all behind, was no longer a fleeting, dramatic fantasy. It was a tangible possibility, a beacon of peace in a sea of emotional turmoil. And in that crushing silence, for the first time, I didn't wonder what I had done wrong. I wondered if I had the strength to save myself. For a long time after Sarah left, I didn't move. I simply sat, the house growing dark around me, the shape of the furniture melting into shadows. The silence was no longer ringing, it was heavy, a physical weight. The breaking point hadn't been a loud, shattering explosion, but a quiet, internal collapse. All the beams and supports I had used to prop up the facade of our family life had finally given way, and I was left sitting in the rubble. I felt an exhaustion so profound it was bone deep, the weariness of a decades-long battle I hadn't even realized I was fighting. I unclenched my fist. The little gold locket had left a deep, heart-shaped impression in my palm. I stared at it, this tiny symbol of a love that was passed down. A love I had tried to pass on, only to have it fumbled and dropped. The story wasn't meant for Sarah, I realized. Not now. Maybe not ever. The story was for me. Slowly, as if moving through water, I got up and walked to my bedroom. I didn't turn on any lights, navigating the familiar landscape of my home by touch and memory. I opened my jewelry box, not the one with the costume pearls and festive earrings, but the small, velvet-lined box where I kept the few truly precious things. I placed the locket inside, next to John's wedding band and a pair of tiny silver baby shoes. I closed the lid with a soft click. It wasn't an act of banishment, but of preservation. I was putting the memory away, keeping it safe from the careless hands of the present. I went to the window and looked out at the snow-dusted street, bathed in the cold, blue light of the street lamps. The world looked clean and quiet and new. It was in that moment of profound solitude, with the house silent behind me and the world asleep before me, that the epiphany arrived. It wasn't a lightning bolt of insight, but a slow, dawning clarity, like the sun rising on a day you thought would be perpetually night. A voice, clear and steady, echoed in my mind. It was my mother's voice, a sound I hadn't truly heard in years, not just a remembered echo but a living presence. It was the voice she used when she was delivering an undeniable truth, something she knew down to her very bones. You can't pour from an empty cup, Eve. I had heard her say it 100 times over the years, usually when I was running myself ragged for the children, for John, for the church bake sale, for anyone and everyone but myself. I had always nodded, smiled, and promptly ignored the advice. It seemed selfish, somehow. A mother's cup was meant to be poured out. That was the job. That was the love. But now, her words held a new and devastating meaning. I looked at my reflection in the dark window pane, a faint, translucent image of the woman I had become. My cup wasn't just empty, it was cracked. It was dry and dusty and couldn't hold a single drop of anything for anyone, least of all myself. I had been trying to pour from a vessel of dust. This realization shifted the entire foundation of my sorrow. The narrative I had been telling myself, the story of a loving mother abandoned by her ungrateful children, was only part of the truth. The other, more difficult part was that I had abandoned myself first. I had willingly, systematically, over the course of decades, emptied myself for them. I had handed over my hobbies, my friendships, my personal ambitions, my very sense of self, piece by piece, believing that my sacrifice was the currency of their happiness. I had taught them that my needs were secondary. I had shown them that my cup was there for the taking, with no expectation of it ever being refilled. Was it any wonder they had learned the lesson so well? My worth, I saw with blinding clarity, was not something they could give me. It was not a reflection in their eyes. It was not measured by the frequency of their calls or the warmth of their invitations. I had been living my life like a mirror, desperately trying to catch a pleasing reflection of myself from them, shattering a little more each time they turned away. But I was not a mirror. I was the source of the light. A strange sense of calm settled over me. The frantic, desperate need for their approval, the gnawing ache of their neglect, it began to recede. It didn't vanish entirely, but its power over me lessened. The problem was not that they had stopped loving me in the way I wanted. The problem was that I had stopped loving myself entirely. This was the true turning point. It was the quiet, seismic shift from victim to agent. The question was no longer, how can I make them see me? But rather, how can I see myself again? The anger and the heartbreak were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but they were no longer the only things I felt. A new feeling was emerging, fragile but persistent: determination. I was 72 years old. I was not dead. My life was not over simply because one chapter, the chapter of being a hands-on, central to their universe mother, had ended. I had been so focused on mourning the closing of that door that I had failed to see all the other doors, and windows, that might still be waiting to be opened. The journey ahead felt daunting, a vast, uncharted territory. I didn't know how to put myself first. I didn't know who I was outside the context of my family. But for the first time in a very long time, I wanted to find out. The love and energy I had been pouring into the cracked vessel of my family, I would now pour back into myself. I would learn to fill my own cup, drop by precious drop. And as I stood there, watching the first hints of dawn pale the eastern sky, I made a silent, solemn promise to the tired woman in the window. I would not be an afterthought in my own life. Not anymore. The morning after my epiphany was the first day of the rest of my life. That sounds like a line from a greeting card, but it felt profoundly true. I woke up not with the familiar, heavy dread, but with a sense of quiet purpose. The path forward was foggy, but I knew the first step had to be honesty. The pretense had to end. I spent the morning at my small writing desk, a pot of tea growing cold beside me, a blank sheet of paper staring up at me. My first instinct was to call them, to force a confrontation over the phone, but I knew my resolve might crumble in the face of their excuses or defensive tones. A letter felt different. It was permanent. It allowed me to say everything I needed to say, in the exact words I chose, without interruption. My hand trembled as I began to write. I wrote 2 letters, one to Mark and one to Sarah. They were nearly identical. I did not write in anger. I did not accuse or blame. I simply stated the truth of my experience, as calmly and clearly as I could. My dearest child, it began. I am writing this because I have been unable to find the words to say it aloud, and I need you to hear me. For some time now, I have felt a profound sense of loneliness and invisibility within our family. I feel that my presence has become an obligation, and my feelings an afterthought. I know you are busy, and I know you have full lives of your own, and I am proud of the adults you have become. But in the process of you building your lives, I feel that I have been left behind. I gave specific examples: the dinner where I was left alone, the Thanksgiving where I felt like a stranger, the dismissal of the locket. I laid them out not as accusations, but as evidence of the emotional distance that had grown between us. The most important part of the letter, the part that took me the longest to phrase, was the conclusion. I am not telling you this to make you feel guilty, I wrote, the pen pressing hard against the paper. I am telling you this because I can no longer continue to live this way. My emotional well-being is important, and I have neglected it for too long. Therefore, I need to make some changes. I will no longer be waiting by the phone for a call. I will no longer keep my calendar clear in the hope of an invitation. From now on, my life is my own to fill. I love you both more than words can say. That will never change. But the nature of our relationship must. It must become one of mutual respect, for my time, for my feelings, and for my worth as an individual. If you wish to be a part of my life, I will welcome you with open arms. But you must choose to walk through the door, and you must be willing to see the person who is waiting on the other side. I signed it simply, Mom. After sealing the envelopes, a wave of fear washed over me. What if they reacted with anger? What if this pushed them away for good? I had to take a deep breath and remind myself that they were already gone, in all the ways that mattered. I was no longer afraid of the silence, because I was choosing to fill it myself. I walked to the corner mailbox and slid the letters through the slot. The clank of the metal flap felt like a gavel, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The confrontation was not immediate. A few days passed in silence. I half expected an angry phone call, but none came. Instead, the following Saturday, they appeared at my front door. Together. They looked uncomfortable, their faces a mixture of confusion and contrition. It was Mark who spoke first. Mom, we got your letter. I led them into the living room, but I did not offer them tea or fuss over them as I normally would have. I sat in my armchair, the seat of my newfound power, and simply waited. It was their turn to fill the silence. We had no idea you felt that way, Sarah said, her voice small. She wouldn't meet my eyes. We never meant to make you feel invisible. I know you didn't mean to, I said, and my voice was steady. That's the problem. You didn't think about it at all. Meaning to or not, the result is the same. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he'd had since he was a teenager. The letter felt harsh, Mom, the truth can be harsh, I replied evenly. Living with the unspoken truth has been harsher. For me, this was the first boundary. I did not soften my stance. I did not rush to reassure them that it was okay. I did not apologize for making them feel uncomfortable. I simply held my ground, letting my words and their impact sit in the room. They were taken aback. They were used to a mother who would absorb their discomfort, who would smooth things over. This new version of me, calm and unyielding, was a stranger to them. So what does this mean? Mark asked. You're not going to see us anymore? Of course I will see you, I said. But it will be on different terms. It will be a two-way street. It means I will not sit home alone on a Sunday afternoon waiting to see if my children will deign to have dinner with me. It means that if you want to see me, you will make a plan. You will call. You will treat me as you would any other person in your life whose presence you value. The conversation was difficult. There were tears from Sarah, and offensive arguments from Mark. They tried to justify their behavior, pointing to the pressures of work and their own families. I listened, but I did not yield. For every excuse, I had a simple, unwavering response: I understand that you are busy. But that does not change how your actions have made me feel. It was the beginning of their awakening. They were seeing, for the first time, the real-world consequences of their thoughtlessness. They were seeing that their mother was not an inexhaustible resource, but a person with her own needs and limits. When they left that day, nothing was magically fixed. The air was thick with unresolved tension. But something fundamental had shifted. I had spoken my truth. I had drawn a line in the sand. And in doing so, I had taken the first, crucial step from being a passive recipient of their neglect to being an active architect of my own life. The fear was still there, but for the first time, it was overshadowed by a powerful, exhilarating sense of self-respect. The letters and the difficult conversation that followed were like tilling hard, compacted soil. It was exhausting work, and it left everything looking messy and overturned. But it was necessary. It was the only way anything new could grow. In the weeks that followed, I focused on that new growth, turning my attention away from what my family might or might not do, and turning it inward, to the neglected landscape of my own life. The first thing I did was reclaim my space. The house had felt like a silent shrine to a family that had moved on. Now, I decided, it would be a sanctuary for me. I started with the living room. I moved the furniture around, breaking the old, stagnant arrangement. I bought a new, brightly colored rug to replace the faded one. I went through the dozens of framed photos, the ones that had become painful reminders of my loneliness. I didn't throw them away, but I curated them. I kept the ones that brought me pure joy, a picture of John and me laughing on our honeymoon, a silly photo of the kids in Halloween costumes. The formal, posed portraits that felt like relics of a different life, I packed away carefully in a box. I was no longer decorating for an imagined audience, I was creating a space that pleased me. Then, I began to fill the silence. I dug out my old record player from the attic, along with my collection of jazz albums that John and I used to listen to on rainy afternoons. The warm, crackling sound of Ella Fitzgerald's voice filled the house, chasing away the ghosts of neglect. The music was mine. It held memories of love and companionship, not of loss. I picked up old hobbies, threads of a former self I had let drop. I had always loved gardening, but in recent years had let the flower beds become overgrown with weeds, my enthusiasm sapped by a general sense of apathy. I bought new gloves and a trowel and spent hours on my knees in the cool spring earth, pulling up weeds with a vengeance that felt deeply therapeutic. I planted vibrant, cheerful flowers, zinnias and cosmos and sunflowers. As I worked, my hands in the dirt, I felt a sense of connection to the earth, to the cycle of decay and renewal. I wasn't just planting a garden, I was cultivating my own resilience. The bravest step I took was reaching out to people. My social circle had dwindled over the years, a common casualty of aging and my own inward focus on family. I forced myself to be brave. The local community center offered a weekly book club. The thought of walking into a room full of strangers was terrifying, But the thought of another quiet Wednesday evening was worse. I went. My heart pounded as I opened the door, but I was met with friendly, welcoming faces. Most were women my age, with their own stories, their own losses, and their own triumphs. That first meeting, I barely spoke. But I listened. I listened to them debate the merits of a novel, to them share stories about their grandchildren, to them talk about their travels and their gardens. I felt a spark of camaraderie, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with being someone's mother. The next week, I offered a small opinion on the book's protagonist. The week after that, I found myself laughing at a joke someone made. It was in that book club that I met Clara. She was a widow, like me, with a sharp wit and kind eyes. She had 2 sons who lived across the country, and she spoke of them with a mixture of love and realistic acceptance. One day, over coffee after our meeting, I found myself confiding in her, the story of my loneliness and my letters to my children tumbling out of me. She didn't offer pity or platitudes. She just nodded, her expression full of understanding. "Good for you," she said, stirring her coffee. The hardest and most important boundary we ever set is the one that says, "I am worthy of my own time." It takes most of us a lifetime to learn that. Her friendship became a lifeline. We started taking walks together, going to matinee movies, trying out new cafes. With Clara, I wasn't Eve the mother or Eve the grandmother. I was just Eve. We could talk for hours about everything and nothing. She saw me, not as a relic of the past, but as the person I was right now. Her friendship was a mirror that reflected a version of myself I was starting to like, a woman who was interesting, funny, and capable of forming new, vibrant connections. Slowly but surely, I was rediscovering who I was outside of my family roles. The journey was painful at times. There were days when the old loneliness would creep back in, when I'd see a family laughing in the park and feel a pang of my old sorrow. But the feeling no longer consumed me. It was a wave that would wash over me and then recede, because now I had other things to hold on to, a book to finish for my club, a plan to have lunch with Clara, a new flower bed to design. My life was beginning to have its own rhythm, its own color. I was no longer a satellite, waiting to be pulled into someone else's orbit. I was becoming my own planet, generating my own light and heat. It was a profound and empowering transformation. I was not just reclaiming my life, I was creating a new one that was smaller and quieter in some ways, but infinitely more my own. The changes in my life did not go unnoticed by my children. My newfound independence, my refusal to be the passive, ever-available matriarch, had sent a shockwave through our family dynamic. The ball was in their court, and for a while, they didn't seem to know what to do with it. My phone was quieter than ever in the first few weeks after our confrontation. A part of me, the old, insecure part, feared I had pushed them away for good. But the new, stronger part of me knew that this silence was a necessary pause, a space for them to think. Then, things began to shift, not with a grand gesture, but with small, tentative steps. It was Sarah who reached out first. She called one Tuesday evening. My initial instinct was to assume she needed something, a babysitter for the kids or a recipe. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice hesitant. "What are you doing?" "Hello, Sarah," I replied, my tone pleasant but neutral. "I was just reading. My book club is discussing a new novel tomorrow." There was a pause on her end. "Oh. Right. Your book club. How is that?" "It's wonderful," I said honestly. "I'm enjoying it very much." The conversation was stilted at first, full of unfamiliar territory. She wasn't calling to ask for something or to offload her daily stress. She was calling to connect. She asked about the book. She asked about my garden. It was awkward, like two strangers learning a new dance, but it was a start. Before she hung up, she said, "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About the locket." "I'm sorry. I was rushing, and I was being dismissive. I'd like to hear the story about it sometime, if you're still willing to tell it." Tears pricked my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. "I'd like that very much, Sarah." It was the first crack in the wall of her self-absorption. She was beginning to see me not as a function, the mother, the helper, but as a person with stories and feelings of her own. Mark's approach was different, less verbal. A week later, on a Saturday afternoon, my doorbell rang. It was Mark, holding a bag of takeout from a local deli. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, avoiding my eyes. "I thought you might not have had lunch yet." It was a flimsy excuse, he lived 30 minutes away. But I understood what it was, an olive branch. I invited him in, and we sat at the kitchen table, eating sandwiches in a comfortable silence that was vastly different from the tense, empty silences of the past. He looked around the living room, noticing the changes. "Place looks different," he commented. "I moved some things around," I said simply. He nodded slowly. "It looks good. Brighter." He started stopping by more often, sometimes just for 15 minutes on his way home from work. He'd help me with a heavy pot in the garden or just sit with me on the porch. He wasn't a man of many words, much like his father, but his presence spoke volumes. He was making an effort, not out of a sense of grudging obligation, but because he was starting to understand the value of what he had almost lost. He was seeing that a relationship with his mother was not a given, but something that required nurturing. Our relationships were beginning to evolve into something new. They were more honest, more deliberate. The old, easy intimacy of their childhood was gone, and perhaps it could never be fully recaptured. But in its place, something more mature and arguably more meaningful was starting to grow. It was a relationship between adults, based on mutual respect and a conscious choice to be present for one another. I learned to say no. When Sarah called in a panic one day, asking if I could watch the kids because her babysitter had cancelled, and I already had plans to go to a museum with Clara, I hesitated for only a second. "I'm sorry, dear, but I can't," I said calmly. "I have plans." There was a stunned silence on her end. Then, "Oh, okay, Mom. I'll figure something out." She didn't guilt me. She didn't push. She accepted my boundary. It was a small moment, but a massive victory. I was no longer the family's default emergency plan. I had a life, and they were finally learning to respect it. This new dynamic was not perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when old patterns threatened to re-emerge. But now, we had a new language to navigate them. The resentment I had harbored for so long was beginning to dissolve, replaced by a cautious optimism. My children were seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time in years. And they were beginning to realize that the love they had taken for granted was not unconditional. It required their participation, their presence, and their respect. In demanding my own worth, I had inadvertently taught them how to be better children, and how to build a relationship with me that was real. The path to healing is never a straight line. It's more like a spiral, circling back on itself, revisiting old wounds from a new, higher perspective. My relationship with my children was improving, but the deeper work, the healing of my own heart, was a solitary journey. It was a day-by-day process of unlearning a lifetime of self-neglect and practicing the new, unfamiliar art of self-love. There were days of regression. One afternoon, I found myself instinctively reaching for the phone to share a piece of good news with Sarah, a rare bird I had spotted in my garden, before remembering she was likely in a meeting. The old pang of loneliness hit me, the reflexive desire for her validation. But instead of letting the sadness settle in, I took a different action. I called Clara. Her delight was genuine and immediate, and we spent 10 minutes happily discussing the bird's markings. It was a small but conscious rerouting of my emotional energy, from a source of potential disappointment to one of guaranteed appreciation. I continued to build my life, brick by brick. My friendship with Clara and the women from the book club became a cornerstone. We formed a small, informal support system. We celebrated each other's small victories, a perfectly baked cake, a finished knitting project, a difficult conversation successfully navigated. We mourned each other's small sorrows, a dear pet's passing, a disappointing doctor's appointment. This community of women provided a different kind of nourishment from what a family could offer. It was a relationship of peers, of chosen sisters, and it filled a space in my heart I didn't even know was empty. My relationship with my children continued its slow, careful reconstruction. It was a delicate dance of advance and retreat. Sarah invited me to lunch one day, just the two of us. We went to a quiet cafe, and she asked me to tell her the story of the locket. As I spoke, telling her about my mother, about being 16, about the hopes and fears of a young woman so long ago, I saw a new kind of attention in her eyes. It wasn't the distracted impatience of before, but a genuine, thoughtful curiosity. She was seeing me not just as Mom, but as Eve, a woman with a life and a history that existed long before her. "I never thought to ask about your life before us," she admitted, her voice soft with remorse. "You were always just there. The constant. I took that for granted." "We all did," I said, reaching across the table to pat her hand. There was no bitterness in my voice, only a gentle sadness for the years we had lost to that thoughtlessness. Forgiveness, I was learning, was not about condoning their behavior. It was about releasing myself from the prison of my own resentment. I was no longer seeking an apology or validation. Their changed behavior was apology enough. My own peace was validation enough. The healing process required me to navigate the complexities of our new dynamic while fiercely protecting my boundaries. When Christmas rolled around again, I didn't wait to be told what the plans were. I called both Mark and Sarah in early November. "I'd like to host a Christmas Eve brunch this year," I announced. "From 10 until 1. Anyone who would like to come is welcome. I'd love to see you all." I stated my plan clearly and without expectation. I was not demanding their presence, but offering an invitation into my life, on my terms. By setting a specific time frame, I was also signaling that I had my own plans for the rest of the day, which I did: a quiet evening with Clara, watching old movies and drinking mulled wine. They were both surprised, but they accepted. And on Christmas Eve, my house was filled once again with the sounds of my family. It was different from the chaotic holidays of the past. It was calmer, more intentional. And when 1 o'clock came, and they prepared to leave for their next family obligation, I felt no sense of abandonment. I felt only a quiet satisfaction. We had shared a lovely morning, and now, I had a lovely evening to look forward to. The greatest healing came from within. I learned to enjoy my own company. I took myself on dates, to museums, to concerts in the park. I even booked a solo trip, a 3-day excursion to a small coastal town I had always wanted to visit. The thought of traveling alone was initially terrifying, but it turned out to be liberating. I moved at my own pace, ate where I wanted, saw what I wanted. I discovered I was a pretty good traveling companion for myself. The transformation was not about erasing the past or creating a perfect, Hallmark card family. It was about accepting the reality of what was, and building something new and beautiful from the pieces. My relationships were more honest, if a little more complicated. But my relationship with myself was the one that had truly blossomed. I was no longer a ghost in my own home, a footnote in my children's lives. I was the protagonist of my own story, and I was finally learning to love the character I was becoming. 2 years have passed since that bleak Sunday afternoon when I sat alone in my armchair, feeling like a piece of forgotten furniture. The woman who sits in that chair today is someone I barely would have recognized back then. The house is the same, the floral pattern on the chair is just as worn, but the silence is different. It's no longer the suffocating silence of neglect, but the peaceful, restorative silence of contentment. My life is full. Not with the constant, demanding hum of raising a family, but with the quieter, richer melodies of my own choosing. My garden is a riot of color from spring until fall. My bookshelf is overflowing with stories waiting to be read and discussed. My calendar has lunch dates with Clara, community center meetings, and long, blissful stretches of nothing at all, which I have come to treasure as much as any appointment. The transformation I have undergone has been profound. The emotional weight I carried for so long, the heavy cloak of disappointment and invisibility, has been lifted. In its place is a deep, abiding sense of freedom. It's the freedom to say yes, but more importantly, it's the freedom to say no. It's the freedom that comes from knowing my own worth is inherent and not dependent on anyone else's approval. My relationship with my children has found its new, healthier rhythm. It is not perfect, and it never will be. The scars of our past are still there, faint lines that remind us of the pain we navigated. But the wounds have healed. The love between us is now grounded in mutual respect and conscious effort. They call regularly, not out of duty, but out of a genuine desire to connect. They ask about my life, my friends, my thoughts, and they truly listen to the answers. They share their own lives with me, not just the highlights, but the struggles, too, seeking my advice not as an all-knowing oracle, but as a person whose wisdom they have come to value. Last month, for my 74th birthday, they surprised me. It wasn't a lavish gift or an expensive party. They arrived together, with my grandchildren in tow, carrying a large, flat box. Inside was a beautifully framed, professional photograph of the three of us, taken recently. We were all smiling, and it wasn't a posed, forced smile. It was genuine. My eyes, I noticed, were bright and clear. Beneath the photo was a small brass plaque. It read, "Eve. Our mother, our friend." Tears stream down my face as I read those words. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of gratitude. They finally saw me. All of me. I have found a peace within myself that I never thought possible. Happiness, I've learned, is not a destination you arrive at, but a home you build within yourself. My home is no longer a silent museum of what was, but a vibrant, living space filled with music and books and the smell of baking. Baking I do for myself, simply because I enjoy it. I still have the locket my mother gave me. I wear it sometimes. The story it holds is still precious, a link in a chain of love. But now, I know that the most important love story is the one I am writing for myself. I have learned to prioritize my own happiness, to fill my own cup until it overflows. The love I now share with my family and friends is the joyful overflow, not the desperate dregs from an empty vessel. This morning, I sat on my porch with my first cup of tea, watching the sun rise. The air was crisp, and the world felt full of possibility. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was a text from Sarah, a simple picture of a flower from her own garden, with the message, "Thinking of you, Mom." I smiled, sent a heart emoji back, and returned my attention to the rising sun. The call was a lovely addition to my morning, but it was not the center of it. I was the center of it. And in that quiet, unassuming moment, I understood the true meaning of freedom. It wasn't about walking away. It was about finally, completely, and joyfully arriving home to myself.